welcome to Between the Headlines, broadcasting from London. Tonight, the press delights in how Britain's Chief Security Minister, Lord West, performed an astonishing about-turn in the space of less than an hour on whether the UK needs to extend the period for which it can detain terror suspects without trial. Meanwhile, grim warnings about an economic slowdown in the West dominate newspapers in Britain and America. Could it upset the electoral chances of the governing parties in elections in both countries in the next couple of years? And in France, the newspapers focus on strike action by transport workers as President Nicolas Sarkozy tries to overhaul the French economy. Helping me to go between the headlines tonight are two former BBC political correspondents. On my right is Lance Price, who went from the BBC to become the deputy to Prime Minister Tony Blair's then official spokesman, Alastair Campbell. Lance later wrote his memoirs, The Spin Doctor's Diary, which spilled at least some of the beans. And next to him is Nicholas Jones, who went from the BBC to write 4 books exposing the dark arts of political spin doctors, most recently Trading Information, which reveals how politicians and their aides manipulate the British press. Welcome to you both. So who has been spinning in the newspaper headlines today? Well, it's poor, hapless Lord West. You see him there in his naval uniform. And the headline you see in The Guardian, an unusual headline. They have 2 parts to it. The line, what he said at 8:20 in the morning, I'm not convinced we need to hold terror suspects longer than 28 days. And then 9:05, what is that, 45 minutes later, actually, I am convinced. How Lord West said, aye to the PM. And The Guardian tells us that at 8:20 yesterday morning, Lord Admiral Alan West of Spithead, Gordon Brown's Chief Security Minister, seemed pretty clear in his own mind. Did he think the police needed more than 28 days to question terrorist suspects? I want to have absolute evidence, he said, that we actually need longer than 28 days. And the former First Sea Lord went on to say, I want to be totally convinced because I'm not going to go and push for something that actually affects the liberty of the individual unless there is a real necessity for it. I still need to be fully convinced that we absolutely need more than 28 days, and I also need to be convinced what is the best way of doing that. But less than an hour later, following a breakfast with the Prime Minister, West had changed tack. And he said this, I personally absolutely believe that within the next 2 or 3 years, we will require more than that for one of those complex plots, more than 28 days. So I am convinced that is the case. He added, I'm quite clear that the greater complexities of terror plots will mean that we will need the power to detain certain individuals for more than 28 days. Now, Lance, I just want to put you back to your days working in 10 Downing Street as a press officer. You hear, or a colleague tells you, that one of your ministers has just gone on radio here in Britain to say that he's not convinced of the necessity of some policy that the government is putting into practice. What do you do next?
It happens very rarely because most politicians know not to go onto the airwaves in the way that Lord West did yesterday morning and say things that don't appear to be in line with government policy. But when it happens, and it did happen a few times when I worked at Downing Street, you're pretty sharply on the phone to the minister concerned, and words are put together which try and get you out of the mess that person's got you into. And normally it involves as dignified a retraction on behalf of the minister as you can get. I mean, this one, of course, was pretty undignified because it did appear to be a pirouette or an about-turn, to use the military parlance. He's, after all, an admiral. So it's never done very gracefully, but it's simply not acceptable in Britain or actually in any other country. I mean, if you're a member of the government, you're supposed to support government policy.
So you say some words are written, but who does that writing?
Well, normally it's done by somebody within number 10. I mean, in my day, it was Alastair Campbell who would write out a statement on behalf of some erring minister in which that minister clarified his or her position and suddenly was found to be back in line with government policy by the time Alastair had done his redrafting. And
one wonders what happened at that breakfast meeting. The Guardian says exactly what was said between West and Brown over orange juice and yoghurt at Downing Street was uncertain last night, but it led to the Admiral executing a perfect U-turn at full speed. What do you think was said?
Whether the Prime Minister said to him, you know, this won't do, or whether even before that breakfast had started, the press people behind the scenes were sorting it out. I mean, there's a funny little aside to it, because apparently the Minister was in the BBC studio, and he then heard the 8:30 news after his interview, which said that Lord West had said that he wasn't convinced, and he turned to his press advisor and said, "Why are they saying this about me?" And the press advisor said, "Because that's what you said, Minister." And it was pretty obvious that he was just being a little naive, quite honestly. I mean, he was kind of almost thinking aloud live on BBC Radio, which is not really a very good idea. When you're a politician, you're supposed to have your thoughts in your mind before you actually go on the air.
And Nicholas, it seems that perhaps not a good idea to be honest and frank if you're a politician.
No, because of course the problem is that Lance Price, as he was then in Downing Street, and his successors are very, very concerned if someone like a minister comes out on the radio questioning government policy, because it's a gift for the opposition parties, because they're immediately going to be able to say, look, Prime Minister, your own ministers don't even support you. And of course you have to understand that in Britain we live in a media world par excellence. More newspapers, more radio and television stations than anywhere else, other comparable country. And the government believes it cannot afford to let stories like this go on without some control. And that's why people like Lance are there at the Prime Minister's side to make sure that they're going to manage the media as best as they can.
Well, Lance, I mentioned that you wrote this book, The Spin Doctor's Diary, inside number 10 with New Labour, which spills, as I say, some of the beans of what went on, as it were, in terms of press relations from 10 Downing Street's point of view. But did you have any examples of any comparable episode when you were working there?
The